I am not against the non-GMO stuff, generally speaking. Uh, I, I don't shop at Whole Foods, but if you do, good for you. Uh, I am not against Whole Foods. I do think our culture is not quite obsessed, but moving toward obsession about the purity of foods and the way they were grown. It cracks. I'm kind of an evil person sometimes, but there is a product I see advertised on TV. It's a home delivery of meats and proteins. And one of the things they talk about is humanely raised pork. And I'm thinking, we're talking pigs, for crying out loud. Please don't hurt the feelings of the pigs that you butcher so that you can send me their chops. All right. It's all this. I can't get started because I won't stop. But there's on the one hand, there is a legitimate press for pure foods, and I don't think that's wrong. There was a time when nobody thought about, is this food pure? Now we would sometimes think, is this dirty? Is there some disease in it? That's not the same thing as pure. Maybe it's a good thing. For all I know, it is a good thing for us to pay more attention to the purity of our food. I do know this much about purity. It is one of the eminent, huge, most significant things about a true follower of Jesus, that we have a commitment to purity. Paul talks about this. He writes to Timothy, and we're in 1 Timothy chapter 4. We looked at verse 12 where Paul says, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, and in purity. So let's talk. We just scratched not even the surface, the subsurface of the idea of purity. Let's kind of unpack that and dig deeper with it. There are several different ways that either we pursue purity or we don't. Or it's a very broken approach, but it happens. We pursue impurity. Now, in Paul's day, century 1, religiously, the world that he lived in was simply not pure. It was a world of idolatry, and where these idols were actually fashioned into statues, bowed down to, false deities were worshipped. And in the best case scenarios, these, for us today, they fit in the category of Greek and Roman mythology, but these figures were worshipped because that was the only way they could organize the world in a way that it would make sense. To worship and to offer sacrifices to this, we look at it, and even Paul looked at it and said, these are false gods. But they were reaching for something beyond themselves. It doesn't make it okay. But what it says is they didn't know. When Paul was in Athens, he began talking to the intelligentsia. Athens was a very interesting, unique city in the Greco-Roman world in century 1. Luke, the writer of Acts, says everyone in Athens just sat around listening to and offering philosophical opinions. Well, Paul said he looked around and he said, I see that you're a very religious city. You even have a monument to an unknown God. As if the effort, and these are my opinions, but as if the effort was, I don't want to miss any of the gods that I need to please and placate. And then Paul presents the fact that there is a living God. And you can read it for yourself in the narrative of Acts. So I guess what I'm saying is Paul lived in a world where religious purity was kind of a unique commodity. Okay, so what does religious purity look like? Well, now that gets, I won't say dicey, but there are many opinions about what that looks like. And now let's pull it down out of the religious atmosphere into the spiritual, which I think is a layer deeper than religious. Spiritual purity, what does that consist of? Now, there are people who believe that spiritual purity means if I'm going to be pure spiritually, it means I obey God. Gotcha. And I see that. That I think is legitimate. One of the difficulties is that sometimes that can lead to what is really just rule keeping. And it is possible to keep most of the rules without having a pure heart. And the reason I say this is because the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they describe how the Pharisees were terrific, meticulous rule keepers. But they didn't have, this is not true of all of them, but as the majority, they didn't have a pure heart. Now, we don't have any Pharisees around today. Yeah, we kind of do. They're not like the sect of the Pharisees in century 1, but there are a lot of legalists who are measuring people's value and standing with God by how well they keep the rules. Obey, obey, obey is their theme song. Well, actually, their theme song is, we obey better than you do. You ever been around those people? I find them really difficult to embrace. It's like hugging a porcupine sometimes. Well, Paul, the Holy Spirit through Paul, when he talks to Timothy about purity, he's not just, it's that, I think this may be the better way for me to say it. He's not starting with rule keeping. He's starting where Jesus started in terms of purity. And you find this in Matthew chapter 5 where he talks about the Beatitudes. Remember? Blessed are the pure in spirit, for they shall obey the rules. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God. I think it was C.S. Lewis who wrote it. It was a pretty, it was a pretty sure bet. These are my paraphrased words. For Jesus to say that the pure in spirit would see God, because only the pure in spirit really want to see God. What is it about this pure in spirit? How does that work? What does a pure spirit look like? Well, a pure spirit, in my opinion, is not something you achieve and are done. A pure spirit is something that is maintained. It begins with my desire to somehow discover God's design and give my focused, sometimes strenuous attention to living within His design. And this happens progressively. It doesn't happen in a flash. It doesn't happen in an instant. It's not a moment. It, like so many other things in our walk with Christ, is a process. We grow and develop in our purity. And here's the other thing. Impurity will always be looking for a way to wedge into what we want to be our pure spirit. The devil is just that way. He's looking for every and any opportunity to somehow press into and so bring impurity into our pure spirit, our pure heart. So part of this process is for us to recognize impurity and, in partnership with God's grace and the Spirit of God, to eliminate that out of the picture. Well, that's a lot of words for just saying purity. This purity is about your heart and your mind. And so it comes down to this. What I am putting into my mind and allowing into my heart will determine a level of purity or impurity. You have to, if you're going to seriously pursue this process, you have to think about, evaluate what's going in. What am I letting in? This has to do with outside influences. It has to do with the things that we hear and see. It also has to do with the things that we repeat to ourselves in our mind. And that would take me down a long road. We don't have time for the long road, so I'll just have to say it this way. Observe your heart, your mind, your spirit. What are you allowing in that will not nurture purity? And in partnership with Christ, push those things aside. Eliminate those things. Easy for me to say. Boy, it's hard to do sometimes. But make a beginning today to identify those things and eliminate them in the power of Christ. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.